Hello and welcome to BYJU'S IAS. Let's take up the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper by looking at a column from page number 6 of the Delhi edition. This article deals with the topic of affirmative action and the reservation system in the country. See, recently, the government of India introduced reservations for OBCs or the other backward classes in the NEET examination. This has renewed a debate on caste-based census and has brought the debate on affirmative action into the limelight. See, affirmative action is nothing but the constitutional policy to provide for reservation in government jobs and in education for the oppressed and deprived classes in the society in order to provide for their social upliftment. This reservation system was introduced into our constitution by our founding fathers in order to fulfill the principle of justice and deliver social progress to India's oppressed classes, particularly to the lower and oppressed castes, which have suffered for centuries in India's deeply unequal society. This policy of reservation in jobs and education has been relatively successful as it has managed to deliver social mobility to several oppressed and downtrodden classes and has led to their social upliftment. As a result of this affirmative action, several members of the SC/ST community and OBCs have not only risen to political power, but have even managed to secure better jobs and better seats, which in turn has led to the general upliftment of the entire community itself. But however, this policy of affirmative action has been deeply problematic as well. Even though it has managed to deliver social mobility to a few classes, this policy of affirmative action has been deeply unequal, and the benefits of this reservation policy has been largely cornered by just a few castes and by just a few elites within each caste. So essentially, within the SC/ST community and within the OBCs, only a few subgroups have benefited, whereas many other groups are yet to receive the benefits of social upliftment. And this unequal benefit of the affirmative action policy is directly attributed to the flawed assumption that every subgroup suffers from the same disadvantage. The writer brings out this flawed assumption and states that internally within these groups, the extent of oppression, the extent of discrimination, deprivation, and disadvantage faced by each group would be different and contextual, and unless and until customized reservation is provided to these groups, the policy of reservation will continue to be politically misused for electoral gains by turning only few castes and few elites into a vote bank. Political parties which have risen to power have used the reservation policy to just target a few dominant groups and dominant castes, and this has even led to the misuse and abuse of the policy of affirmative action. In fact, this argument of the writer is not just based on assumptions, it is based on solid data that was brought out by the Justice Rohini Commission's report on the subcategorization of OBCs. As per this report, 97% of the OBC quota at the central level has been cornered only by 25% of the eligible castes. The remaining 75% have been largely left out from these benefits. The report also shows that amongst 983 OBC communities, nearly 37% of them have zero representation in government jobs and in central education institutions. Then this report of Justice Rohini Commission, which focused on central government jobs and admissions to central universities, shows that nearly 25% of the central government jobs and seats at central institutions have been cornered by just around 10% of the OBC communities. This stark inequality in the application of the reservation policy is a direct result of the assumption that every subgroup within these oppressed classes suffer from the same disadvantage. Hence, the writer says that there is an urgent need to reform and revitalize India's reservation system, which has contributed immensely to the strengthening of the Indian democracy. If India could emerge out of the difficult days following independence, and if India could remain a strong, united democracy, A large part of the credit goes to the reservation system, which provided for social upliftment and social mobility. Despite its flaws and problems, this policy has seen tremendous success, and it has been a constitutional tool that has guaranteed social justice and social upliftment to the oppressed classes, which have suffered for centuries in India's deeply unequal society. But however, today, the flawed implementation of this policy and its politicization has led to several problems in its implementation, and its benefits have become lopsided, as only a few castes, few communities, and few elites have managed to draw their benefits, whereas several other subgroups have been largely left out, thereby breeding a new kind of inequality. Then the writer says that to understand the true impact of the policy of affirmative action and to understand the extent to which it is benefiting the different castes and subgroups, we need quality, reliable data. See, the Justice Rohini Commission's report is not sufficient for this because this commission focused only on central government jobs and on admissions to central universities and central institutions. There is no such reliable data available for the state level and the local level, and this is where he points out the importance of the socio-economic caste census. To truly bring out the socio-economic conditions of different castes and different social groups, we need a country-wide socio-economic caste census on the lines of what was conducted back in 2011 under the then Manmohan Singh government. The writer says that such socio-economic caste census should become a regular part of governance, which could help in bringing out the extent of deprivation and disadvantages faced by different castes and subgroups, and any policy of reservation should be framed on the basis of such data. The writer also says that we do not have sufficient data to understand the impact of LPG reforms, that is, the impact of liberalization, privatization, and globalization on the oppressed classes. Because while the LPG reforms opened up numerous economic opportunities to India's urban class and middle class, it is not entirely sure as to how it has benefited the lower sections, especially the OBCs, the SCs, and the STs. Because many of the backward classes, they rely upon traditional sources of livelihood, and they were placed at a severe disadvantage when the LPG reforms were introduced. So to understand its impact and to gain deep insight into the socio-economic conditions of these oppressed classes, we need quality, reliable data. Hence, the writer presents a way forward to revitalize and reform India's reservation system. First, he says that we need to come out with customized reservation for each caste and each subgroup based on their context and based on the evidence that is collected through such socio-economic caste census. To implement such a policy, we need to establish an Equal Opportunities Commission, similar to the ones that have been established in other countries such as the United States and the United Kingdom. Such an impartial, independent Equal Opportunities Commission can come out with a deprivation index and even provide a rank to different castes and subgroups based on the extent of deprivation they are suffering from. Such an index needs to be developed and designed on a scientific basis based on the data that has been collected through the socio-economic caste census. Through this, the different backward classes can be ranked and categorized, and accordingly, customized reservation can be provided to them so that the policy of affirmative action becomes more equal and uniform, thereby helping address the problems in the current system. Such an Equal Opportunities Commission can even regularly take up a performance audit of different government employers and education institutions with regard to how they are implementing the policy of reservation in order to gauge its effectiveness. So in short, the writer says that socio-economic caste census is a precondition which is absolutely necessary to reform India's reservation system, and hence the government should not only consider making the socio-economic caste census a regular feature, but it should also consider the recommendations of the 2008 expert committee, which recommended the establishment of an Equal Opportunities Commission. Now let's take up a column from page number 7 that deals with the legislative dysfunction being seen in our parliament. See, the parliament is seen as one of the critical institutions in a democracy, and it is even considered to be the temple of democracy. Because the legislators, that is the MPs, who act as the elected representatives of the people, they are expected to use the parliament and their lawmaking powers to ensure that the laws that are being passed by the parliament are in line with our constitutional principles. But quite often we have witnessed that there is a complete lack of deliberation within the parliament on key bills, and several bills have even been rushed through in the parliament without much of a debate, which, according to the writers, has rendered the parliament into a rubber stamp institution. It has been noticed that either the government is pushing through these bills in a hurried manner without allowing for enough deliberation and discussion on the floor of the House. Several critical bills are passed by using a majority of the government in order to avoid discussions and deliberations on key aspects of the bill. In other cases, there is constant disruption of the parliament's functioning caused by the opposition parties as well. And this constant political standoff between the government and the opposition parties has directly affected the quality of deliberation that goes on in the parliament while passing critical bills. Then there have also been instances where the government has tried to bypass constitutional procedures by classifying regular bills as money bill, because as per the provisions of Article 110, once a bill has been classified as a money bill by the Speaker of the Lok Sabha, then it restricts the powers of the Rajya Sabha to push for amendments of the bill. We saw this happening in the case of Aadhaar bill, when the government classified the Aadhaar bill as a money bill in order to bypass the Rajya Sabha. See, Article 110 clearly states that only a few category of bills that deal with specific subjects can be classified as a money bill. For example, those bills dealing with taxation, those bills dealing with borrowing, appropriation of money out of the Consolidated Fund of India, only such bills which affect the government's finances, only they can be classified as a money bill by the Speaker. But this provision is often misused by the government to bypass the Rajya Sabha and in order to get controversial bills passed through the parliament by exploiting the majority the government enjoys in the Lok Sabha. Then there are also procedural violations seen in the case of counting of votes in the parliament while a bill is being enacted. Under Article 100, there are clear provisions that specify as to how counting should take place. When a bill is being voted upon, the ayes and the nays have to be clearly counted. And apart from the counting procedure, the Constitution also provides for a voice vote. But in many cases, the majority party in the parliament bypasses this procedure, thereby defeating the very purpose of the parliament. There have been several instances where key bills have been enacted into laws without properly counting the ayes and the nays. And in cases where voice vote was adopted, despite strong opposition by the opposition parties, bills are passed, which again affects the quality of deliberation within the parliament. So such rushed lawmaking in the parliament and bypassing of constitutional procedures has effectively rendered the parliament into a rubber stamp, according to the writers. They point out that unfortunately, the efficiency of the parliament is being measured by the volume of bills that are being passed, that is, by the number of bills that are being passed. But the writers argue that the efficiency of the legislature can be decided not just by the number of bills that are being passed, but more importantly, by the quality of deliberation that is taking place on the floor of the House. Because see, when laws are being enacted by the state, that is by the executive, these laws might curtail a few fundamental rights, and it might affect the interests of individuals, businesses, and even place several obligations on the citizens. So considering that these laws might come into conflict with constitutional provisions such as fundamental rights, there is a very important need within the legislature to deliberate, discuss, and debate whether these laws are essential in the first place. What purpose does it serve? How does it propose to achieve its objectives? Does the state have enough empirical data to justify these laws which might be restricting rights and affecting interests of the citizens? The legislators have a duty to check whether these laws are proportional and necessary. Laws enacted by the parliament, they have to pass the test of proportionality, because the measures being employed by the law has to be proportional with the objectives that it is seeking to achieve. Through such deliberation and discussion on the floor of the House, the legislators have to check whether these laws being pushed by the state, do they violate fundamental rights? Do they bypass any constitutional provisions? Through such deliberations, legislators will have to even push for amendments and propose changes to the law in order to make it more suitable and constitutional, keeping the interests of the citizens in mind. Then Parliament is also the platform where expert opinion can be brought in from the outside by pushing the bills for review by the standing committees of the Parliament, and this will allow the legislators to carry out a more careful review of each and every provision, of each and every clause, and even provide for representation to the concerned stakeholders, and even consult with experts in that particular domain to generate a wide opinion. So the Parliament has been designed in the Constitution to be a truly representative participatory institution. But because of the legislative dysfunction that we witness, due to the rushed laws that are being passed through, and due to the lack of deliberation and frequent violation of constitutional procedures, the Parliament has ended up becoming a rubber stamp, and this directly erodes two important constitutional ideals in a democracy, which is equal participation and the fundamental rights of the citizens. So considering the seriousness of this issue, the writers are calling upon the judiciary to play a positive role to improve the lawmaking process in India as it has been outlined in the Constitution. In fact, recently, the Chief Justice of India also brought out these concerns because he stated that if there is no adequate deliberation on the floor of the House, and if bills are rushed through, and if such laws are enacted, then it places an unnecessary burden on the judiciary because such laws which have been rushed through will contain several loopholes and gaps, and hence it will invite challenges in the court where, through the tool of judicial review, the litigants will be seeking a review of the law on the ground of its constitutionality. So as more and more such cases are filed, it increases the burden on the judiciary, which otherwise could have been easily handled, provided if the legislators were doing their job. If there was enough deliberation in the Parliament, if the MPs were asking the right questions and carrying out meaningful debates, then these loopholes and gaps in the laws could be addressed and fixed by pushing suitable changes into the law through amendments, which in turn would help in protecting not just the rights of the citizens, but would also reduce the burden on the judiciary. Hence, the writers are calling upon the judiciary to play a positive role to improve lawmaking in order to address the current state of legislative dysfunction being witnessed in the Parliament. But however, there are limits on the extent to which the judiciary can interfere in the lawmaking process, because the judiciary would be bound by the doctrine of separation of powers, which clearly demarcates the jurisdiction between the legislature and the judiciary. So while declaring laws as unconstitutional or while carrying out judicial review, the judiciary is always concerned about breaching the doctrine of separation of powers. And this feature of the Constitution, which is a part of its basic structure, limits the extent to which the judiciary can interfere in the lawmaking process. But however, the judiciary can deploy the tool of judicial review in order to check the laws that have been passed by the Parliament for any procedural violation which has been listed out in the Constitution. The tool of judicial review is one of the most powerful tools in the hands of the judiciary to protect the fundamental rights of the citizens, and it allows the judiciary to check the constitutionality of a law. So if constitutional principles and constitutional procedures are being violated, and if the lack of deliberation in the Parliament is making our laws violative of fundamental rights, then the judiciary can definitely consider this to be one of the factors while it exercises its power of judicial review. See, in case of a judicial review, the Supreme Court, which would be testing the constitutionality of a law, is mainly focused on whether the law is violating any of the fundamental rights. So the writer suggests that the Supreme Court can go a little beyond this and expand the scope of judicial review to even check for parliamentary provisions and procedures being followed, and if they are seen to be openly violated, then this could become a ground for declaring the law as unconstitutional. For example, in the Aadhaar case, the Supreme Court did recognize that money bills are being wrongly classified and categorized. Then in the Indian Hotels and Restaurants Association case of 2013, the Supreme Court held that if fundamental rights are being curbed by a law, then Sufficient empirical data should be present to justify these restrictions. Without valid facts and data, the state simply cannot restrict fundamental rights, and such laws can be declared as unconstitutional by the court. See, generally, when laws are enacted by the parliament or even by the state legislatures, they are presumed to be constitutional under the doctrine of presumption of constitutionality. Since the legislatures are constitutional bodies, they would be expected to follow and uphold the constitutional provisions and procedures. And initially, when a law is enacted by the legislature, the court presumes that the laws enacted by the legislature are constitutional. But this doctrine of presumption of constitutionality allows the government to continue enforcing the laws even while the law is under judicial review. And after there is a sufficient delay, the government can argue in the court that rights and obligations created under the law should not be disturbed by the court just for a mere procedural violation. So to prevent this, the courts will have to restrict the application of doctrine of presumption of constitutionality. And especially if there is proven procedural violation in the parliament, the courts will have to intervene immediately and declare the laws as unconstitutional. By doing that, the court can push the legislatures to focus more on deliberation and discussion, and at the same time, the judiciary won't be violating the doctrine of separation of powers. Next, according to this article on page number 8, India and Russia are all set to sign a logistics sharing agreement. India is holding separate bilateral talks with Russia and United Kingdom to conclude a logistics sharing agreement which will benefit the armed forces on both the sides. Such logistics sharing agreements primarily benefit the Navy as it allows the Navy to improve its operational turnaround time by seeking refueling and resupplies at the military facilities of the other countries. This will also promote the interoperability amongst the forces. So often friendly navies and countries with strong defense relations, they enter into such logistics sharing agreement, which allows the armed forces of one country to access the military bases of other country for the sake of logistics. This is a reciprocal arrangement which would benefit the armed forces on both the sides. And within a month or two, India and Russia are all set to sign the RELOS, or the Reciprocal Exchange of Logistics Agreement. And a similar agreement is also being worked out with the United Kingdom, and these talks are in their final stages of negotiations. Parallelly, India is also talking to Vietnam about signing a similar logistics agreement. India has already signed several such logistics sharing agreements with friendly countries, including the United States, with which we signed the LEMOA, or the Logistics Exchange Memorandum of Agreement, back in 2016. Today, India has such a logistics sharing facility with all the Quad members, including with Japan and Australia, and as well as with other friendly countries such as France, Singapore, and South Korea. Such logistical support would be critical for the Indian Armed Forces, especially for the Indian Navy, and it not only increases the operational reach of the Indian forces, but it will also improve their operational turnaround time as they can access refueling resupply facilities at these foreign military bases. Now let's look at this article from page number 9, which deals with the camp model of governance being implemented by the Chhattisgarh state government in the Naxal-hit areas. See, as Naxals target the government machinery and as they try to exploit the governance deficiency to further promote their left-wing extremist propaganda, the state government is looking to improve its governance by directly reaching out to the people who are affected in the Naxal-hit areas. For this purpose, the Chhattisgarh state government has implemented the camp model of governance. Under this model, first the security forces, that is the state police with the support of the central armed police forces, they sanitize an area and ensure that the area is free of Naxal insurgents. Following this, they set up a camp where all the concerned and relevant government agencies will also set up their facilities. At these camps, which are largely maintained and run by the security forces, they not only guarantee safety for the government officials from any possible attack by the Naxals, but also other essential infrastructure such as high-speed internet is provided at these camps. So through these localized camps, the government agencies can provide for basic services and welfare to the local people and thereby help improve the state of governance in the region. So villagers from the nearby areas are encouraged to visit these camps to access government facilities, and they are even incentivized by the government by offering them food and their travel expenses. So this is essentially a model where the governance machinery itself is being taken almost to the doorstep of the people, and it is helping the Chhattisgarh government to address the deficiency in governance or the lack of governance in the Naxal-hit areas. Now let's look at the mains practice questions. The first question: a socio-economic caste-based census becomes a necessary precondition to initiate any meaningful reform and to revitalize India's reservation system. Analyze the statement. The second question: rushed lawmaking in the parliament has rendered the institution into a rubber stamp and sacrifices the core ideals of a constitutional democracy. Critically examine. And while examining this statement, also talk about the role that the judiciary can play in improving lawmaking. So kindly write an answer to these questions and post your answers on the answer writing portal, for which the link shall be shared in the description box below. So with this, let's conclude our discussion for today. Thanks for watching.